Hello, my name is Michael Glass. I'm the Regional Studies Association's Territorial Chair for the United States. The Regional Studies Association is a learned society concerned with the analysis of regions and regional issues. Through our international membership, we provide an authoritative voice of and network for academics, students, practitioners, and policymakers. You can find out more about the Regional Studies Association, including information on membership, funding opportunities, and events at regionalstudies.org. I'm pleased to present a new installment of our Regionalists on Film series that introduces you to the work of established and emerging regional scholars and their scholarship. Today, it's my special privilege to introduce Dr. Ann Taufen. Dr. Taufen is an associate professor in the School of Urban Studies at the University of Washington Tacoma. Her research focuses on equitable governance, port city infrastructures, and the socio-ecological networks of urban regions. She's co-editor of Routledge's new Handbook of Sustainable Cities and Landscapes in the Pacific Rim. And welcome from Hawaii.
Thank you so much, Michael. Of course, I don't live in Hawaii normally, but it is a wonderful place to be greeting the new academic term and seeing colleagues in person and talking with you on Zoom. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, my pleasure. Now, I love to start these with a little bit of a genealogy. Could you explain how you first became involved in or interested in researching regions and sustainable development?
Thank you so much. It's such a great question. And I guess the thing that came to my mind is what a privilege it is to be able to even think to oneself what we're interested in and where we might be making a contribution. I think that the capacity to think about how regions influence our experience and the growth of communities for me was really influenced by my childhood and growing up in a household where the gendered labor of having a mother who worked hard and was kind of progressing in her in a field that was not previously open to women made me very aware of the power of the neighborhood that I lived in, being supported by a village and a network of people who were able to make my experience as a child one of agency and growth and safety, and that I was able to navigate through parks and to school and these sorts of things. And it wasn't until we moved to a more diffuse environment that was really more typical of post-World War II American sprawl style development and became disembedded from networks and structures that are otherwise frequently the source of our health and well-being, that there was a really sharp change. So it was not so much about capital and mobility in that sense, but the ways in which, in my experience, the gendered labor structure of changing households in the 1970s was differentially supported by different spatial arrangements. And so I think now we call that the social determinants of health, and I'm glad to see that getting more attention nationally and internationally. But that really has been the genesis of my interest in spatial development and regional development, and why some communities experience more opportunity and growth and thrive and are healthier than others. And it's certainly, of course, not just about gender, but also about race, about disability, about ethnicity, about immigration status, about all sorts of identifiers and positionalities that intersect with the shape of regional development.
Well, that's tremendous. And so one of the things that you've been working on over the past few years is ideas about ports and port infrastructure. And that's, of course, part of the infrastructure turn in policy sciences and social sciences. So how does that fit with the genealogy that you just laid out? And can you explain more about the work on port infrastructures and how that intersects with regional studies?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. I think I'm going to start again with a kind of personal motivation, which is that the interface between marine and terrestrial ecosystems and just the experience of nature at the water's edge has been a kind of through line in my research. But from a more functional regional studies perspective, the infrastructure of ports is really the nexus of global flows and shapes so much of how coastal regions develop. What kinds of supply chains and labor and the shape of economic development across coastal metropolises. In many ways, the infrastructure of ports is not unlike the influence of timber frame construction and highways in the post-World War II era, where it is really a technological driver for how we're seeing megacities develop. So in terms of regional planning and the influence of ports on regions. While in space and time, a port is physically constrained to relatively small space, they also are the coming together of so many of the flows that interest us as regional and international scholars. I think the prospects of entire coastal metro areas are tied up not only in how ports are designed and carried forth and the position of labor and different market economies in those spaces, but also the competition between ports. And as we know, we live in a global era, and so the ways in which ports are able to secure investments and require the provision of opportunities and access to their local populations really drives a lot of the kind of structural conditions of human experience.
The Seattle-Tacoma metropolitan area is part of a number of different regionalisms that we can talk about, whether it's Cascadia or the Pacific Northwest. And I'm sure that the particular emphasis on sustainability that you find there shapes some of the reflections that you've made through the research that you've done over the last few years with collaborators.
Absolutely. So one of the innovations from a governance perspective in our region has been the creation of an alliance of the Pacific Northwest seaports between Seattle and Tacoma, for instance. So in the same way that LA and Long Beach have recognized that coordinating together helps them to compete more successfully internationally, we've started to see a lot of that in the Puget Sound area. We know that with the ports in British Columbia, Prince Rupert and Vancouver areas, as well as Portland, the Cascadia region together is a really important gateway for this entire region of the continent. And I think it is an open opportunity for more international collaboration between states, which historically has been hard to get off the ground. You know, in the US, we have a federalist structure that rewards competition and punishes cooperation. So finding ways to work together and kind of recognize the prioritizations between the smaller regions within Cascadia, whilst also acknowledging that there are requirements to try to address the carbon problems and the climate change impacts that port traffic and the nature of consumption and production are the impacts that are being caused for climate, that all of these things need to come together, and that at the end of the day, it's really a governance challenge and a coordination challenge that requires some political agility, shall we say, and we hope that the research that we're doing and the on-the-ground understanding of context where the governing constraints and the institutional histories are really shaping those potentials, that we can do a very careful and hopefully nuanced and targeted and effective job of trying to understand where and how we can make better progress on these things.
Now, as far as that level of understanding is concerned, I mentioned in the introduction the new handbook that came out with Routledge, and that book takes a more trans-Pacific perspective on issues of regional sustainability challenges. What did you learn about city landscape development during that process of working internationally?
Indeed, it's a wonderful question. It was a great collaboration. My colleague Yichao Yang at the University of Oregon has just been extraordinary, and I've learned so much from the opportunity to work with her and with other scholars through the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub. And that's the meeting that I'm here in Hawaii for right now. It's our 5th meeting. We started in Portland in 2017. And the handbook was really the way that we kept scholars in conversation and working on substantive outcomes throughout the pandemic. It's a huge volume. And I think really many of those chapters will be more valuable to folks online. A lot of them are open access and can be downloaded through Routledge. 9 sections, 61 chapters, over 100 authors from all around the Asia Pacific region and around the Pacific Rim. And I think the thing that really came to the fore is how much context matters, that different coastal regions have very different cultures and histories and governing arrangements and institutional constraints, and that we can have the best science in possible. And we've known this for years from policy studies perspective, that it's often not the science actually that is the constraining factor, but the politics and the culture and the capacities to get things done are really quite different in different settings. And so the need to understand more about what is going to matter in Manila, what is going to help drive something forward in Tokyo, how a project can get off the ground in Vancouver, that there are similarities, but there are also profound differences, and getting better at understanding and generalizing to a point of comparability and actionability around the differences is really a key need, frankly, as we're trying to make progress in this post-COVID era and hopefully address climate change and climate justice more significantly.
I'm sure all of those findings are opening up some thoughts about what lies ahead as well. And have you had much of an opportunity to think about the state of regional scholarship and what you might like to see regional scholars addressing, or maybe some of the challenges that are lying ahead of us as a field?
Thank you, indeed. And I wish that, for more opportunities to interact in person with the scholars that we've been able to have these conversations with. One of the other initiatives through APRU has been something called the Asia Pacific Mayors Academy, in collaboration with UN ESCAP, UN Habitat, the United Council of Local Governments, Asia Pacific, and other entities. And so bringing that forward through the pandemic has required a lot of perseverance and support, and our UN partners have been really extraordinary. But one of the things that has shown us is that these relational dynamics and the opportunity to learn from each other, what my colleagues in policy mobility recognize as the exteriority of relations and the importance of understanding where and how we can make interventions that are going to be successful. In my view, this really goes back to the significance and the importance of an interpretive approach to research, that in addition to the positivist and quantitative metrics that have long defined the field of regional science and regional studies, we are really quite overdue for rigorous, qualitative, comparative work that is able to generalize around conditions that require a methodological turn that is devotedly interpretivist and qualitative, and that we understand data in a multiplicity of ways and become more respectful and adept at taking that context seriously. So I would say that one of the very most important things that I'd like to see more of, and we are in fact seeing more of, and I'm fortunate to have been trained in traditions of ethnography and qualitative analysis, is more discourse analysis and more care with the framing dynamics of building discourse coalitions that can then move into effective advocacy roles for the kinds of policy interventions that we need to see. The other thing that I think would be great to see more of, and again, the scholarship is there around the false dichotomy between international and domestic policy flows and networks. I think it would be wonderful if we were able to train our students and professionals and practitioners to navigate the divide between domestic and international networks and recognize that in many instances they are one and the same. And so I think from a research perspective, for regional studies, for infrastructure, the group, the NOIR group that you have been so forward thinking and recognizing the need for coordination along with colleagues to recognize that this global and domestic as well as interpretivist and quantitative divide, that they really, we're in a moment where we're navigating those a little bit more carefully and or ambitiously is a wonderful opportunity.
Oh, that's tremendous. Well, thanks so much for those insights. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have to spend with you today. But I'd like to thank you so much for joining us to share your perspective on regional scholarship. I'd also like to encourage all of you watching to learn more about regional studies and the Regional Studies Association at regionalstudies.org. Anne, would you care to have the last word today?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the invitation. I would just say that we are excited about the opportunity to be working on a regional policy center, and the idea of framing is something that driving research into practice and looking for those areas of common ground. One of the things as we're coming out of COVID, I hope, is the ability to break down disparities and standoffs politically in the US and elsewhere. That perhaps one of the most important things that we could be doing is working to understand one another better and to limit the damage from things like the pandemic and climate change. So we hope that a more practically oriented policy center in the Pacific Northwest and at UW Tacoma or in the South Sound region will really help to move forward on many of the things that you and I have been talking about today. Thank you.
Excellent. I wish you the best with that. And thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Michael.